He was the quintessential child prodigy who perfected the styles of classicism. I'm the classical nerd, and, well, this guy doesn't need an intro, does he? Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in January 1756 in Salzburg, Austria, and was the son of the famed violinist and composer Leopold Mozart. From an early age, it was clear that Wolfgang had an ear for music and naturally picked out stuff on the keyboard that was pleasing to his ear. His tiny little improvisations and all the pieces he heard in his everyday life led him to start writing music at the age of 5. Mozart is seen as being in a league of his own when it came to child prodigies. And while he was very prodigious at a very young age, there are 3 things we really need to keep in mind when we're talking about his prodigy. One is that writing music that early is not at all uncommon when we're looking at composers as a whole. He's not the be-all end-all because he wasn't the composer who started composing the earliest. In fact, when we look at the history of composers who started writing their first pieces at the age of 5 or even earlier, we see Mozart, but we also see Mendelssohn and Saint-Saëns, and even Ralph Vaughan Williams. The second thing to keep in mind is that no matter who the composer is, if you're writing music that young, you're guided by intuition and intuition alone. You haven't had time to develop that intuition, and you haven't had time to develop the other compositional tools that go into writing a really good piece. As a result, if you hear an early piece by any of these composers, chances are that it's short and rather amateurish. The third thing is that the earliness of his prodigy was never and should never be considered his primary claim to fame. There's a mythicality to Mozart that has grown up around the idea of him being just the greatest prodigy to ever have lived. And in fact, he may very well have been the best prodigy, but that's only because of what he achieved later in life. He should be known for what he did as an adult, not necessarily the cool factoid of him being a prodigy. Put simply, there's a difference between being a prodigy and being a genius, and the fact that Mozart was a prodigy had no bearing on the fact that he was also a genius. In any event, within 2 years of his first attempts at composition, the Mozarts struck out on a European tour. Wolfgang and his sister Maria Anna, nicknamed Nannerl, had impressed the Holy Roman Empress in Vienna, and Leopold was keen to capitalize on the success of his children. For over 3 years they were on the road, and their travels took them to modern-day Germany, Belgium, England, France, and the Netherlands. This concert tour was utterly grueling, travel was slow, and illnesses were quite common. Mozart, as it turned out, would later go on to develop a distaste for the French, calling them musically illiterate. Nevertheless, despite the conditions, the experiences of this tour were hugely impactful on Mozart and the connections he was later to make between styles of different composers. His meetings with Johann Christian Bach, the so-called London Bach, because almost all of Bach's kids were named after the cities in which they ended up working, was incredibly helpful to Mozart because he learned from J.C. Bach how to write a good concerto. J.C. Bach's concerto style would become the starting point for Mozart when he wrote his mini-concerti that focus on balance between the soloist and the orchestra. The classical era also saw music on the cusp of a revolution in terms of funding. Up until this point, throughout the history of Western art music, composers were subsidized by the aristocracy. You either had a court job, pumping out music on demand, or you had a church job and were also an organist. But by Mozart's day, the taste for opera had gone mainstream, and it was theoretically possible that a very good opera composer could make it on his own. They could, in theory, survive solely on their operatic successes, but this was a dangerous job, and nobody really wanted to play that game, because it was expensive to produce, it took a long time to write, and if you had just one failure, you could be in dire financial straits. Although Mozart's first operas were successful, remarkable given that A, debut operas usually suck because composers don't generally know how to write for the stage, and B, Mozart was 14 when he wrote his first one, the idea of going freelance was just not something that was in his head. It was too outlandish, and it would be a while until composers could successfully do that. After his European adventure and a later excursion to just Italy with his father, Mozart got a court position. This was what most composers did if you expected to make a living in the art, and his was in the Salzburg court, so he kept it local. Although people were still largely impressed with the world-famous Wunderkind, he wasn't able to actually use that in order to make ends meet. The trouble was, the older he got, the less he and his father could make money solely off of his reputation. Nobody wanted to see a child prodigy who wasn't a child. The Salzburg opera scene lagged behind that of many other European cities, and the pay for his court position was just low. So he and his father set out again. This backfired because courts around Europe were getting sick of Mozart parading his son around, especially because at that point he wasn't really a child prodigy anymore. They got sick of Leopold, not necessarily his kid. By mid-1777, the younger Mozart decided to quit his job at the Salzburg court, and he struck out on his own for Paris. This was a disastrous journey. He nearly went broke, and during this, his mother died. Just before his 23rd birthday, he reluctantly returned to Salzburg. 2 years later, and Mozart got another chance of breaking out of the Salzburg position, which he saw as below his level and increasingly menial. He arranged to meet the new Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, and while the emperor was definitely impressed by Mozart's skills, Mozart still didn't get a job. Gosh, was Mozart the original millennial? We have to imagine that this in large part was because he was still technically a member of the Salzburg court. And if you were a court musician, you couldn't just leave. You actually had to negotiate a release, even if you wanted to do freelance work like Haydn did, or if you wanted to have a leave of absence that was paid or unpaid, you had to negotiate everything. I mean, if you had a court position, you were essentially a musical servant. Mozart's increasingly obvious desire to gain a better court position elsewhere enraged the archbishop, who summarily fired him. He literally kicked him out the door. Like, he was fired by being thrown out the door and literally getting a kick on his rear end on the way out. Very insulting. Mozart's beef with the archbishop came largely as a result of him also rebelling against his father, because his father wanted him to stay in Salzburg. Instead, Mozart believed that his talent, combined with his work ethic and the changing times, meant that he could actually make it on his own as a freelancer. He still wanted a court position, but he realized that he could actually make ends meet between court positions. He didn't have to line up another job before quitting the one he had. He could make it as a freelancer for a time. But as mentioned, it hadn't been attempted before, and it was to lead to years of financial hardship. Because of this, he had to write for the public. So his compositions became focused on two genres. One, the opera, which was very financially lucrative if you wrote a good one, and it was popular. And two, pieces for himself to play. So piano concerti, for instance, because performers were paid much, much better than composers. At this point, Mozart moved to Vienna, but Vienna proved to be a mixed bag. He was not able to secure an official position, and so he combined the roles of composer and performer. He wrote and premiered a handful of piano concerti per year. He also became fast friends with Joseph Haydn, at this point the elder statesman of the classical style. The duet performed together in string quartets, with Mozart playing the viola. The two composers admired each other's work a great deal. Mozart's 14th through 19th string quartets were collectively known as the Haydn quartets because they were written for and dedicated to Haydn. So indebted was Mozart to what he'd learned from study of Haydn's scores and his friendship with the old master. But he went a step further. He actually assigned the royalties of these pieces to Haydn, as if Haydn had written them himself. Something that was a very bold move, considering that Haydn was pretty rich and Mozart was essentially living paycheck to paycheck. Haydn did not turn this offer down, but was greatly touched by it. Haydn was a humble and kind man, and told Leopold Mozart that his son was the greatest composer he knew of. Haydn had taken the early string quartets, which were essentially vehicles for the first violinist to show off amidst some basic string accompaniment, and turned it into a conversation amongst equals. And Mozart took this to another level. He really refined what Haydn had brought to the table, and wrote pieces that were the pinnacle of the classical style. You see, Mozart was not really an inventor of forms. That honor goes to Haydn, known as the father of the string quartet, the father of the symphony, and we can also argue that he's the father of sonata form, even though sonata form was not really something that these composers thought of. It was a later addition by musicologists to describe what they saw. Haydn had such high praise for Mozart because he saw in the youngster a lyrical melodic gift, something he himself, ever humble, felt lacking in, but also an innate sense of the classical style. It seemed as though Mozart just had it in him. He didn't have to learn the style so much as the style was part of who he was as a composer. Humor is an element, therefore, in Mozart's music, but it's not as much of an element as it is in Haydn's music, where he's known for being an outright musical jokester. Mozart's genius was that he perfected the forms that already existed in the culture in which he was born. The differences in how they made their livings were also profound. Haydn exemplified the old style, being employed by the Esterházys for pretty much his entire life, certainly his entire professional career, whereas Mozart was the first who had to try to make it as some kind of freelancer. Because Haydn wrote pieces at the pleasure of the Esterházy family, he had to write pieces that, by and large, did not see the light of day after their premiere, whereas Mozart had to write pieces for public consumption and make them good. And Mozart was able to do that very well, which is why more of his pieces have stayed in the repertoire versus more of Haydn's. Haydn wrote more symphonies, but we usually hear more Mozart symphonies. When Haydn wrote all these baritone trios because the prince played this old instrument called the baritone that nobody plays anymore, and so nobody plays the Haydn baritone trios even though he had to write them. It's a very stark contrast between the old in Haydn and the new in Mozart. Mozart was fond of a good joke, though. He wrote a piece called A Musical Joke for Horns and String Quartet where he parodies, both subtly and outright, bad composition and bad performance. But if Haydn is the quintessential musical jokester, then Mozart is the quintessential musical prankster. Take, for instance, an aria from his opera Così fan tutti. This particular aria has a lot of leaps from low to high. He wrote these in because he found the lead soprano immensely irritating. Now, the leaps themselves weren't necessarily the problem. He wasn't trying to make it extremely challenging for the soprano soloist. This soprano, Adriana Ferrarese del Bene, was apparently very gifted in both her extreme high and extreme low registers, but she had an idiosyncratic quirk. She would throw her head back on the high notes, and she would dip her head forward on the low ones. And so when Mozart wrote an aria that went up and down and up and down, the result was, and here I quote, to have her head bob like a chicken on the stage. It's a myth that Mozart's Viennese life was entirely poor. For a while, he and his wife Costanza could live a very upscale, near-aristocratic life, funding his love of living large and dressing nicely, often because he was getting proceeds from his latest opera. However, they rarely, if ever, saved any money, and so as soon as the opera finished its run, they would go back to being poor. One month, they could live like kings, and the next like paupers. While the concerto composing and performing life was quite successful in its own terms, Mozart still wanted to be a great opera composer. So in 1785, he began a collaboration with librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. Da Ponte would become Mozart's primary librettist for pieces such as The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and of course Così fan tutti. This was a true collaboration. Da Ponte at this point had worked with a number of other composers on other operatic projects, including Antonio Salieri, and he wanted to bring out whatever his compositional counterpart did best. As Mozart is widely regarded as having one of the greatest senses of writing for the voice of all time, he afforded Da Ponte a tremendous amount of freedom in the libretto he could craft. The libretto only required two main things. One, it had to have a good sense of dramatic form, and two, it had to be, well, easy to sing in Italian. And let's be honest, anything sounds good in Italian. You could sing a grocery list as an aria and it'd sound beautiful. But Mozart wasn't just comfortable writing operas in the traditional forms. Yes, he used the traditional forms, but he went a little bit further with them, and decided to incorporate more things that composers of operas didn't usually do, for the sake of making them both dramatically really gripping and also musically balanced. Let's take Don Giovanni, for instance. Like a Shakespearean problem play, it's not really a tragedy, but it's not really a comedy either. It's a dramma giocoso. It's a kind of fusion of both, taking the best elements of both of the genres. It's almost like a dark comedy, and the reason it stuck around in the repertoire is because it combines these opposites in delightful and inventive ways. In these mature operas, Mozart created a great and grand sense of drama while still paying attention to the kinds of forms used by classical composers. There's a little something for everyone, and that is the key to understanding what Mozart's music was really about. So there was this theory posited by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, yes, another one of the Bach kids, that musical listeners could be divided into two groups, Kenner and Liebhaber. The Kenner, which derives from the German kennen, which is one of the two German words which means to know, were people who really had a sense of what was going on. If they listened to a piece, they could understand the form. If they listened to a fugue, they could tell you if the fugue's answer was real or tonal. They were people who really knew the craft. The Kenner were connoisseurs of music, people who knew the contrapuntal masters of the High Baroque and still honored what they could do in the play of tones. On the other hand, the Liebhaber, which comes from the German liebhaben, which means to love, or more literally, to have love, were just folks who wanted to hear a good tune. Like, they went to the opera so they could go away singing one of the arias. They didn't really care about the intricate details. C.P.E. Bach had written a series of sonatas and published them as Sonaten für Kenner und Liebhaber, and Mozart made explicit reference to these two groups of listeners in letters to his father. He said that, basically, his best pieces were those that combined elements of these two styles, where a Kenner listener could listen to it and a Liebhaber listener could listen to it, and they could both get something out of the same piece, preferably the same moment within the piece. It wasn't just a good tune here and a nice fugue over here. He'd create good fugues out of these nice, short, little singable tunes. Take the finale of his 41st and final symphony, commonly known as the Jupiter Symphony. The finale is a tour de force of invertible counterpoint. He has these short, singable Liebhaber phrases arranged in such a complex contrapuntal way that could be appreciated by a Kenner. It's clear that Mozart was thinking melodically because he said that melody was the essence of music. He once compared contrapuntal experts to hacks, but in this case he was probably thinking of counterpoint for the sake of counterpoint. Counterpoint without a good tune to be heard amongst the different voices. While he clearly paid homage to the contrapuntal experts of the past, he had to have known his Bach. Otherwise, there was no way that he could have written all the great counterpoint that he did, and deploy it in such a subtle fashion. The Jupiter Symphony also prefigures the romantic concept of cyclicism, where movements of a piece would be linked together not because they just happened to be a part of the same piece, but rather because they shared motifs between movements, something that just hadn't been done before. This began in full force with the music of Beethoven, who actually came to Vienna to study with Mozart, although Mozart was dead by the time he got there. Mozart was the first to do this because, well, you just can't explain some of the inter-movement connectivity in the 41st Symphony without thinking that Mozart was thinking in a sort of proto-cyclical sense. By the end of 1787, Mozart had gotten what he'd been after for years, a court position with the emperor. However, this really was below his talents. Much like his Salzburg position, it didn't actually mean that he got to do a whole lot for the court, and he got paid very little because of it. He would still freelance as he had to in order to make enough money, and because what he was expected to do for the court was a very minimal amount of work that amounted to a handful of dances per year. His concertizing income also waned, and that's because he was focused on opera, and at that point, opera was an extravagance that just wasn't getting funded. You see, Austria made a treaty with Russia, and the Russians and the Ottoman Empire were almost constantly fighting at this point in time, and so when they went at it again, Austria had to join in against the Ottomans with the Russians. This left a lot of artists, not just Mozart, in serious financial difficulty. Mozart tried to fix this by hitching rides with aristocrat friends on their northern sojourns, and he actually went as far as Berlin before coming back, but he wasn't able to make ends meet there either. Mozart tried to make up the difference by writing music as quickly as he could, and he tried to be as productive as he could possibly be. But this was disastrous for his health. He was able to scrounge together enough funds to start paying off debts, a process that doubtlessly involved commissions and funds from various patrons. These pieces included his late opera The Magic Flute, his final string quartets, and his final symphonies. The word final is operative here. Overworked and overstressed, he fell ill in the fall of 1791. Always a fan of rituals and superstitions, he had joined the Masons about a decade earlier. He was convinced that somebody was poisoning him. He He was also commissioned to write a Requiem Mass, anonymously, and he became more and more convinced that this Requiem Mass would be his final piece. He was writing his own death piece. This didn't help his stress level, and it certainly didn't help his health, because instead of taking time off, he poured all of his energy into his Requiem. He left this piece unfinished when he died in the early morning hours of December 5th, 1791. I'm actually filming this on December 5th. This is weird. Contrary to the myth of him having a pauper's funeral, he actually had a fairly modest funeral. Modest in the sense of it was pretty much what you'd expect of a Viennese funeral of someone who was not a member of the aristocracy. The Requiem was completed by Mozart's pupil Franz Xaver Süssmayr, who was put in the unfortunate position of having to complete not just the Requiem, but many of Mozart's other incomplete pieces. With some of the pieces, you can definitely tell where Mozart ends and Süssmayr begins. Not that any of this was Süssmayr's fault, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The exact cause of Mozart's death is, and in all likelihood will remain, a mystery. There are literally hundreds of possible explanations based on what little we know of his symptoms. According to Mozart's son Karl, his father's body stank of death so badly in his latter days that it was so bad they couldn't even do an autopsy after he actually passed. Not like an autopsy from 1791 would actually do modern medical science any good, but, you know. Mozart's post-mortem reputation has centered around his status as a child prodigy, but as we've seen, this is just a small part of his story. You can't get caught up on that, because if you do, you miss the fact that he was someone who synthesized a bunch of different things about the classical era and took what Haydn invented to new and ever more magnificent heights. His prodigy is interesting and certainly impacted his career in profound ways. It probably hurt him in his search for a job more than it ever helped him. To highlight the difference between a prodigy and a composer, take for instance the fact that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe thought that Felix Mendelssohn was a far better prodigy than Mozart. But does this make Mendelssohn a better composer than Mozart? Well, that depends on your taste. But you can't say that prodigy equals great composer. It's two different things. One is interesting, and the other actually has more historical value. Just as Mozart appropriated the techniques of the Baroque to shine a light on his contrapuntal mastery, and applying that to things that weren't just fugues for the sake of fugues, so too did he prefigure some of the Romantic advancements, especially when it came to his use of chromaticism. Mozart's music has an overall surface elegance, a sheen on it, which is aided by a kind of surface-level chromaticism, passing tones, sharpened and flattened notes that don't have any emphasis on the harmony, but they do just give a nice roundness and an interesting quality to the melody. And yeah, it sounds simple, but if you ever try to write a piece that sounds like Mozart, it's just gonna sound like bad Mozart. Crafting a piece that legitimately sounds like Mozart and not a ripoff is actually very hard to do. He does, however, point forward in terms of his creative use of harmony in a couple of pieces. The most famous being the opening of his String Quartet number 19. It's so dissonant and slow in its opening, almost atonal, that it's known as the Dissonance Quartet. There's also this keyboard piece that's not often played called Eine kleine Gigue, which has a striking modernism about it. These are but a few examples of the hundreds of pieces that Mozart wrote in his maturity, but it's telling that really people didn't know what to make of these. Editors who were well-meaning decided that they would edit some of Mozart's typos in the opening of the Dissonance Quartet, and Eine kleine Gigue has never really made it into the repertoire. Mozart's writing for the orchestra is very refined, and he had a great ear for how the orchestra of his day balanced. Of course, the orchestra of his time was a very different beast from the orchestra of our time. He made significant use of the clarinet, then a newcomer for the orchestra, and he wrote an enduringly popular concerto for that instrument late in life. He admired the tasteful deployment of various orchestral effects, and greatly admired the music of Georg Friedrich Handel for his ability to do just that, saying that Handel could strike like a thunderbolt when necessary. This admiration, for instance, may have informed his decision to bring the trombones in, usually a church instrument, when Don Giovanni is dragged to hell in the finale of the opera of the same name. Mozart was also one of the last composers for a long while to find equal success and equal footing in both the operatic and concert worlds. Aside from perhaps Carl Maria von Weber later in the next century, You don't really find that many composers who are known for opera as much as they are for, say, their symphonies, or their chamber music, or their solo music. Mozart could do it all. Mozart was overworked because he was constantly thinking about music. He could be away from the keyboard for a long while and his brain would still be bubbling with ideas. He spent no significant time away from his work, mentally or literally, in almost the entirety of his 36 years. Or nearly 36 years. He composed in his head and he wrote it down later. He thought there was a difference between composing and actually writing it. He did this not just because he had to as a time-saving measure, but also because sometimes he had to perform pieces before they were totally written out. And if he was writing a piano concerto, it's more important that all the orchestra players have their parts, and if he knew his part, he could just write a few notes into himself. Aha, literally a few notes, I just got it. This also lent him a great ability to compose at breakneck speed. One time he had a layover in the Austrian town of Linz, and he wrote a symphony in 4 days. A famous story sees Mozart going to the Vatican and transcribing Rigoglio Allegri's Miserere, a piece that was performed only twice a year and was banned from having its sheet music published. It was about 150 years old by the time Mozart heard this piece, and no one had managed to transcribe it. Mozart listened to it once, wrote it down, went back, made a few changes, and lo and behold, he transcribed it. And if you're wondering, he was 14 at the time, because that's fair. Mozart also has this reputation as being this massive party animal who upset and alienated a lot of his friends with his weirdness. To which I say, while Amadeus is indeed a funny movie, it's not a paragon of historical accuracy. Antonio Salieri played second fiddle, excuse the pun, to Mozart throughout much of Mozart's life and career. But Salieri did not try to poison Mozart, he didn't harbor any ill will towards the guy. These rumors began circulating not long after Mozart's death, and hounded Salieri for the rest of his life. It's gotten so bad that even today, if you ask someone who Salieri was, if they know the name, they know him as the guy who killed Mozart, and not one of the great opera composers of his time. I mean, as always, there were a limited number of positions and commissions, and so they were friendly rivals. I mean, they competed to get these things, but they had no ill will towards the other, and in fact, they actually collaborated on a cantata. Salieri always made it a point to go to Mozart's operas and was one of the most profound supporters of Mozart's operas. Salieri was one of the primary teachers of Mozart's son, Franz. Hashtag justice for Salieri. Not everybody liked Mozart, true, but these were generally members of the aristocracy who thought Leopold was too pushy, and so they weren't going to give his kid a fair shake. Mozart was quite high energy, and while the theory of him having Tourette's has long since been debunked, we do know he liked a good poop joke. So, there's this canon that he wrote in the early 1780s, and it's basically just a round for his drinking buddies. And the words are a little more than its title, which is, I can't believe I'm saying this, Lech mich im Arsch. And no, I am not going to translate that. I might say lech is more like kiss in the vernacular, so you can't take a literal translation of it, you have to take a more nuanced translation of it. So is it really scatological? To which I say, I'm deeply uncomfortable right now, and if you want to be as deeply uncomfortable as I am right now, then maybe you should try reading some of Mozart's letters to his cousin Maria Anna. Like many things Mozart, it's probably all overblown. It was probably just a fun little in-joke that they had. But this speaks to a deeper problem, and is that we're always fascinated with the dark side of the lives of the famous. In fact, our collective cultural fascination with Mozart has led to some rather interesting theories. The so-called Mozart effect, which is almost complete hogwash, states that kids can get a mental boost by listening to Mozart, when in reality, anybody can get a little bit of a boost in cognitive ability for maybe 15 minutes, and it's just by listening to classical music, not just Mozart, but we had to slap the name of Mozart on there because it sells. Leopold Mozart also gets the short end of the stick for being some kind of overbearing and over-controlling father. And while he was probably overbearing and over-controlling to some degree, which backfired, especially when Mozart was trying to get jobs, this was not out of a selfishness on his father's part. It had to do with him wanting the best for his son. They were both strong-willed people who had disagreements over what Wolfgang's best path forward was. Their disagreements were because they both wanted what was right by him. Leopold was in all likelihood just trying to do best by his son and not try to pull the strings to his own personal advantage. Of course, he would benefit by his son being famous, but he mostly just wanted his son to achieve all the things that were promised by his talent. It's telling that Leopold actually gave up writing music so his son could have that as the spotlight. He did not want to step on Mozart's toes, so to speak, even though his overpromotion generally backfired when the younger Mozart tried to get a job. Biographies of Mozart generally differ in this subject, and it's telling about that particular musicologist's bias. And this is not to say that that bias is unfair or unfounded. Many of these musicologists have strong opinions as to whether or not Leopold was over-controlling, or overbearing, or someone who was selfish. The problem is that there's compelling evidence on both sides, and so without a strong case one way or the other, it's easy for biographers to take sides in this disagreement and then create a compelling narrative around one or the other, when in fact the evidence doesn't fully align with one side or the other. So tread lightly. Mozart's music would come to be one of the most profound and enduring sources of inspiration for almost every major composer who came later. This is a through line that stretches from the refined early romanticism of Mendelssohn to the melodious cornucopia of Chopin and Tchaikovsky, all the way through to the dissonant string quartets of Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg was proud that he'd learned all that he had learned about writing for the string quartet from Mozart. Mozart knew that he was talented, but he also knew that with his talent came an obligation to study the great works of the past and the great works of his contemporaries. He was nothing without study of what made great music great music. He did not mind other composers getting performances and acclaim, but he did not like it if he felt like he was being passed up for them. If he felt like he had stronger music, he got rather frustrated when he wasn't getting those performances and accolades. And he often felt that way because, well, he was Mozart. He was convinced that all music should charm the ear. That was actually his definition of music. In his mind, even representations of the worst situations must remain beautiful to some extent. And this moderation between extremes is what has made his music so enduring, for all generations since, and all generations to come.